Hello, everybody. My name is my ancestral name is Thatcher. I am given name as Mark Podlasly. I'm a member of the Intlakatam First Nation, which is the Interior Salish, in British Columbia. But I live in Coast Salish territory in Musqueam. So I am very pleased to be here. As you heard, I am the CEO of the First Nations Major Projects Coalition, which I'm going to take an opportunity to make a plug here. We have our annual conference next Sunday, Monday, Tuesday up the road at the Sheraton. We had 1,700 people last year come, leaders in industry, government, and Indigenous, talking exactly what JP said, the practical application of reconciliation. So you were invited, fnmpc.ca. So I'm going to sit down. I'm going to ask each of the moderators. I'm on two mics. I don't need this one. I can sit down, and we'll start. I will remind you, Slido. These sessions are an opportunity for you to ask those questions, which as Canadians, we are always too polite to ask in person. So type them out. Any question, I promise we can handle it. Okay? So we have an all-star Indigenous panel here. I'm going to start at the end. Just to introduce yourself and your organization. Come this way, and we will begin.
Thanks, Mark. I'm Hilary Thatcher, and I'm the Managing Director for Indigenous and Northern Investments at the Canada Infrastructure Bank.
And I'm Geordie Hungerford, Indigenous Economic Development Consultant and Thought Leader.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Shafak Sajid, and I'm the Director of Engagement at the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corp, and since we love acronyms, AIOC for short.
So, Gilakasan Namut, Niguam, Kikanzi, Gaikala, Muskamuk, Zaudinok. Good morning, everybody. My name is Mike Bonshor. I'm a member of the Zaudinok First Nation of Kinkum Inlet, BC, and the recently appointed chair of the Canadian Indigenous Loan Guarantee Corporation, CILGC.
Yeah. Say that 3 times fast, right?
Everybody, see.
So congratulations. This was a recent appointment, so congratulations. And you've got a very important job coming up, so congratulations.
Thank you, Mark.
So as you heard from JP, this is about what the economy could look like going forward. You're starting to see, as you heard, the Indigenous economy in this country is growing, but it's not just the Indigenous economy. We are Canadians. We are part of a larger economy. And as you also heard, there's nothing like a good crisis in the past 3 or 4 months to focus our attention on where we are going collectively. And it is true. Indigenous participation in major projects is an asset and a competitive advantage. Worldwide, investors worldwide, when they're looking to investments, look to one's risk mitigation, security, speed. Is their investment going to pay off, and can they access what they're after? And in terms of Canada, there has been a reputation over the past few decades that speed is not our fortitude because of issues around Indigenous rights, Indigenous protests, let's face it. What's been happening is that the federal government has been taking individuals from Indigenous organizations on trade missions overseas to Europe and Asia because increasingly you're seeing now Indigenous people becoming co-owners, co-proponents in mining projects, energy projects. You heard about one today from Enbridge, but these exist across the sector. Indigenous people provide, if the projects are compatible with the interests of the Indigenous parties, speed and certainty. And that is now, given what's going on south of us, desperately needed for us to get to new markets and diversify our economy more and more. So what we're going to do is have a discussion around how Indigenous equity participation in projects, how Indigenous participation improves projects, helps projects get done faster, cheaper, allows them to raise money easier, and contribute to the entire Canadian economy, and most importantly, our mutual self-determination as a nation. It's not just about Indigenous self-determination anymore, it's a Canadian self-determination question. So I'm just going to have a quick question. Look at that, I got a question already. That's amazing. So I'm going to ask you questions. I'm just going to direct questions to the panelists, and then we'll have a discussion where we go. So a lot of these questions that we raised, the issues we raised about Indigenous participation projects. I just want to put a question out here just to begin. I'll start with you because you're right here. I know, you jumped. Major projects. What's the main barrier? Why do not Indigenous people participate in more major projects?
Well, I think there have been financial barriers. The As nations have moved towards recognition of rights and title to create the space for equity participation, one of the main barriers has been access to affordable capital to be able to invest alongside industry partners. And so we think we know it's already been proven in other jurisdictions that a loan guarantee from a province or from Canada can enable that. And so that's would be one of the primary roles of the Loan Guarantee Corporation, is to remove that barrier for nations.
So just to back up here, for those of you who don't understand why do Indigenous people require loan guarantees over any other group in the country? Can I ask Geordie, or do you want to answer that? I'm going to come back to you with results. Do you want to answer that?
Yeah,
okay,
I was
answer
going
that.
to jump in if people don't know. Because of the Indian Act, essentially, Indigenous communities aren't able to use their land as collateral, so they don't have that access to capital. And like Michael said, the Loan Guarantee Program and AIOC back in 2019 was created to fill that gap, because the government of Alberta, in our case, is backing the loan that the communities are getting. It's seen as lower risk, and lenders are able to lend to those communities, and often at better terms than you would get in market. I don't know, Georgie, if you had to add anything.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, First Nations don't really have much, in general, of a balance sheet. And so there's very little ability to leverage assets, and part of it is the Indian Act and the inability to leverage reserve lands. But it's also, all these other levels of government in Canada, be it municipalities, provinces, or the federal government, are able to borrow in the capital markets and raise money for economic development type of initiatives. But it's very challenging because there is no real access to the capital markets for First Nations across Canada.
So thank you for that. Again, reminder, Slido, questions coming up would be great. Hillary, I'm going to turn to you. The Canada Infrastructure Bank has been a phenomenal partner of First Nations in helping achieve aspirations for those communities to not only invest but become leaders in projects within their territories. Do you want to explain to us just a bit about how the Canada Infrastructure Bank works with First Nations and the direction that's going?
Sure. So we actually invest alongside First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, so coast to coast to coast. And we see a great opportunity to fill gaps. And gaps that we're trying to fill are usually economic gaps or structural lending gaps. And sometimes it's the risk gap of the project. So, you know, when you're thinking about Arctic infrastructure, there are very few lenders who are going to lend to projects that have uncertain revenue streams. And so the Canada Infrastructure Bank can be looking at those uncertain revenue streams, take risk that other lenders won't, in order to crowd in more private capital. And so with Indigenous communities, we have three main initiatives that we use. One is our accelerator funding, which I see the Premier of Nunavut is here, and we've used this in a couple of projects in Nunavut, the Kavalik Hydrofiber Link and the Grays Bay Road and Port. And those accelerator funds actually help to get the project moving a bit faster. And so it's some of the pre-development work, the financial models, et cetera, to really get that project shovel ready and investment grade. The other thing we do is the Indigenous Community Infrastructure Fund, which is where we're really providing debt to projects to fill a gap that isn't being filled by the private market, by private lenders. Usually it's a smaller scale investment, between $5 and $100 million, and really that helps to get those projects off the ground. And we've done this across a number of projects where communities are owners of projects, but also where projects are situated on Indigenous lands in their communities. So it's serving to deliver wastewater to a particular First Nation, or broadband across rural Alberta, which no other lenders were investing in. The last one I'll say, because it really complements a lot of what the loan guarantee programs are doing, is we do direct equity lending. And so direct equity lending is when an Indigenous community has an opportunity to partner on a major project. We can help by providing that Indigenous holdco a direct loan at very concessional rates, our cost of capital typically, in order to make sure that the community has the capital that they can be an equity investor into the project, which gives them a seat at the table, gives them a voice on the project, and really helps to orchestrate, to your earlier points, better projects being built on time and on budget.
Excellent. So thank you for that. In Canada right now, there are a number of provincial loan programs. There's a federal one that's just been announced. But the one that we know most about is the Alberta program. Shafak, can I ask you, what have you seen over the past 5 years? Because this is the most well-known program in the country running out of Alberta.
Yeah, thank you. So the AIOC program, like I mentioned, started in 2019, really coming out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to action, specifically to support economic prosperity and enable equity ownership in projects by nations. We started as a $1 billion loan guarantee program, really focusing on natural resources sectors. And in the last couple of years, we've seen that mandate expand to $3 billion, as has the sectors that we can support. So in addition to natural resources, we can support telecommunications, transportation, agriculture, and most recently tourism projects as well. And our impact has grown along with that. So in the 5 years, we've done 8 deals in total, which is $725 million in loan guarantees that we've used up out of our capacity. And we've impacted 43 unique First Nation and Métis communities in Alberta. And one of our biggest projects that Devin mentioned earlier was the Enbridge deal with the 23 nations in Alberta. What these investments mean, to Mark's question, is that there are real returns, long-term cash flows flowing to these communities. So net of loan repayment, this is going to mean $1.3 billion for these nations over the next 30 years. So that means a lot in terms of what the nations can do in aligning with their priorities and their goals. I just want to point out, like, it is about numbers and cents, but it's also not about numbers and cents. What drives me and wakes me up in the morning is the real impact that we're achieving. And one of the communities that has participated in a number of deals with us, Whitefish Lake, they had a fire go through the community and burn down their rec center. And so they've used the revenues from these deals to build a multiplex, and actually today is the grand opening of that multiplex. So texting with Chief yesterday, telling him that I won't be able to be there because I'm in Toronto, but just hearing him talk about how this multiplex would not have been possible without these revenues through these deals is really the impact that we're driving for. It's going to bring the youth together, the community together, and spur more economic activity. The communities used to have star baseball and hockey teams, which has not been the case, and so we're really excited to see what impact this multiplex has. But that's really the impact that we're talking about. Some communities have used these funds to build schools or invest in community infrastructure, but that's been the impact of the AIOC story for the last 5 years.
So, Michael, you've heard Shafak talk about what's going on in Alberta's success, and other provinces and territories have tried to emulate the success that Alberta's had. Will the federal loan guarantee work with existing provincial and territorial projects going forward?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Maybe just a little bit more context as well. As JP mentioned, we went from 0 to 10, and there was a stop at 5 briefly, and it's since been doubled to 10 billion, and the mandate's been expanded to include the 5 billion, additional 5 billion to include all sectors other than gaming, and so we have a bit more to work with, and our plan moving forward is to collaborate and partner with Alberta, Saskatchewan, Ontario, and hopefully soon BC to because I think JP mentioned as well that the scale of investment that's anticipated over the next 10 years, 20 years. And so we have 10 billion at our disposal, and I think the total across the country is around 14 or 15 billion, and we're going to need more. And so I think the more efficient we can be by collaborating with provincial jurisdictions, the more beneficial the program will be to Indigenous communities across the country.
So, Geordie, I know that you've been working on different avenues of access to capital for Indigenous communities across the country. Can you speak to that?
Yeah. So one of the things I drafted something called the Roadmap Project a few years ago when I was running the First Nations Financial Management Board. And a lot of that thinking was looking back at, well, how do economies grow? What kind of mechanisms and institutions do we need in order to grow the Indigenous economy? And I reflected on some examples, and one that came to mind was the province of Quebec, and how over the course of the 60s and 70s it was able to really transform itself. And it's through institutions like Hydro-Quebec, for example, major projects. It's through ideas like creating CDPQ, so an asset manager that was then able to go and invest in the economies of Quebec. It was setting up venture capital and other kinds of institutions, and then having development bank types of functions. And so with the loan guarantees, we have some of that in place, but can you imagine, for example, if we had something like all the tools of the World Bank in an Indigenous development bank? So things like loan guarantees, but also other kinds of concessionary financing, other kinds of business-focused kinds of finance. So I think in the future we will see some programs starting to evolve that are on the venture side that will allow nations to be able to participate in some of these value chains that are being created right now in major projects. So it's not just the project itself, it's all the spin-offs of the project with respect to construction, with respect to heavy equipment, and then also on the procurement side for Canada. It's also very exciting. And some of the other jurisdictions as well have procurement programs. But the ability for nations to buy into businesses and then participate in those value chains is going to be really exciting.
Hillary, I have a question here that's come in on the Slido. I'm turning to the Slido questions there at the top. In terms of the projects that CIB has been investing in, some of them have been in community infrastructure, some have been in climate change resilience and preparing communities for changes that are coming that way. Can you speak to that, about the CIB's role in the realities of the projects facing us vis-a-vis climate change? For
sure. We're impact investors, and so we get our mandate from our shareholder, which is the federal government. We've been given a very clear instruction to be investing in the clean economy. So both clean power, renewable generation, SMRs, transmission assets, as well as hydrogen, fueling stations, et cetera, and clean fuels. And so whenever we make these investments, we look to who are the partners and whose land is the project situated on, and how are they involved, whether they're owners or they're getting procurement opportunities. And so we do an analysis of that. But because the BC Hydro call for power was talked about earlier, one of the reasons that those projects that were awarded contracts was so successful, and in fact most of the Indigenous partners own 50% or more in those projects, was because we worked with BC Hydro really closely to put together our tools so that when they went out with their call for power, proponents with their Indigenous partners knew that they could access our Indigenous equity lending tool, as well as concessionary financing to get those clean projects financed. And so with our blended capital there, we're able to attract in more private capital from the proponents and other lenders, and we're able to reduce the cost and the burden on the ratepayers in British Columbia, as well as ensure that the Indigenous communities have access to affordable capital through the CIB loans. And so we've done that in BC. We did a very similar program in Saskatchewan, which needs a lot of help to clean their grid. We're working with Manitoba, Quebec. We've initiated programs like this in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and so we're sort of across the country really trying to help Canada through its clean transition. Those are the renewable energy parts. But I will also mention, because JP talked about SMRs. SMRs are really critical to this country. Some small modular reactors are going to really be a game changer for this country, both from an innovation perspective, but also Indigenous partnership perspective. And each and every one of the SMRs that are being contemplated in regions across the country are inclusive of Indigenous partners, and so we'll be looking at partnerships there, OPG being the closest one in Ontario right now, ready to move forward.
So just as a comment there, we do know that from Indigenous communities in this country, Saskatchewan, Ontario, and New Brunswick are First Nations and those Indigenous communities in those three provinces are very interested in the nuclear supply chain. So it is an area that Indigenous people are taking a strong interest in. There isn't a sector in this country that in some Indigenous community somewhere is not interested. And they go from traditional energy to clean energy to industry to manufacturing to exports. As you mentioned, JP, the billions of dollars, 80 we were at last, the number you used, 80 billion. We're closing in on 100, 60 billion already now, 2022. That was 3 years ago. So where are we at now? So I'm going to open up a general question. Some of these come up. One of the questions that's come in here is, what role can Canada's polytechnic institutions play to meet the skill needs of these major projects? I'm going to leave that open to whoever wants to jump in on that.
I think Geordie actually spoke eloquently just a couple minutes ago about some of the other areas. So, as you're thinking about growth, you've got both financial sectors, but you've got jobs and procurement, construction, you've got skilled trades and labor that needs to be trained up. And so the polytechnics can play a significant role. We don't have enough Indigenous people in finance, and we need more financial managers within communities who are Indigenous, who have the interests of the communities at heart. And so whether it's skilled trades or whether it's the finance sector, I think there's a great need. I see my friend Terry Goodtrack here from AFOA. They're doing microfinancing, certificates on project finance to really bring up the capacity and the skills within Indigenous communities and participants, but that's certainly one area.
Yeah, did you want to go first?
Oh, go ahead.
Just to add on the capacity building piece, that's definitely something I think where the institutions can play a big role in terms of the financial skills. Right now, when nations participate in deals, they're really building that financial acumen, but these are really complex transactions on really complex projects, so anything in terms of capacity building, in terms of programs or financial literacy that can be done to build that acumen would be really helpful.
I'd just add a few other buckets to think about as well. Engineering is an area where we're going to need to see a lot more Indigenous people, so nations can be able to run their own projects, run their own engineering businesses. Also, with respect to communities, there will be a lot of wealth that will be created out of these different business opportunities, and so the needs for trust officers to be trained up, which NATOA does a great job on, but also governance and thinking about governance of these dev corps or GBEs, they call them, government business entities. How can we get the directors trained up to be able to effectively manage the businesses?
Yeah, I guess shout out to my BCIT colleagues in the room. I suspect I know where the origin of the question came from, but
your fingerprints are on that, right?
Yeah, I'm glad that's raised, because I sit as chair of BCIT, which is an institute in British Columbia, and we feel that institutes like BCIT play a pretty key role in helping to build and sustain economies. And so, as you said earlier, we're not just talking about Canadian economy, Indigenous economy. We're talking about how we're going to collaborate and work together. So I think institutes like BCIT and others take the same approach, right? And how we can build capacity, build the skills and technical skills, and build leaders to help us move forward, help Indigenous communities move forward, and help the province and Canada move forward.
So I just wanted to point out on the education piece on this is that I was at a PPF function yesterday. Fantastic discussion about the Arctic and geopolitical questions about how we're going to exert Canadian sovereignty in the north. But we're the people in the north. The Indigenous people are in northern Canada. And the question then is, how do you defend a nation in the north? And that includes not only financial officers, technical officers, there's going to be all sorts of skill sets required. Mm-hmm. And the polytechnical institutions, all the education institutions, are going to play a huge part in what's coming up in the next 10 years in this country.
That's probably a good plug for the new university that's coming to Nunavut as well. So that will be a great institution to help support a broad reach of skills for Nunavutmiut, but also others who want to study and be a part of the growth and development in the Arctic. I
would encourage you, those who are in the south, is that there's an entire active ecosystem in the north. It's not a barren, empty land. It is active. And you know what? All of our futures in the South are going to depend on the future of the North. So, thank you. I want to just ask, we're running out of time here. This is great. These questions are fantastic. We're not going to get to all of them. Actually, I have a general question. I'll go back to AIOC. Shafak, what happens 10 years from now? What does it look like 10 years forward as far as the AIOC looks in terms of equity participation by Indigenous people?
Well, we've been around for 5 years, but I would say AIOC is just getting started now that I've joined the team. But, but really what we're focusing on this year, and Michael alluded to it a little bit, is how are we working together with all of these partners and stakeholders in this Indigenous finance ecosystem. And I just want to take a moment to just acknowledge that milestone that we've achieved, because 10 years ago, it would have been a completely different conversation. And now with the different provincial loan guarantee programs, the federal one with CIB, FNFB, FNFA, all the cool acronyms, it's a really exciting place to be in, to have this entire ecosystem to work with. So how can we collaborate? How can we stack and work together to have improved terms that nations can access in terms of capital, and then have improved returns? But looking forward, Canada is in a pivotal moment, I feel like, where we're having conversations about sovereignty, energy security, or food security. And what's important in that is the key critical piece that Indigenous equity ownership has in that path. We're not a part of this, it's not just a thought, but it's how can Indigenous equity ownership lead that path going forward.
Do you want to comment? You don't even know, you don't have an office yet, so what's going to happen next week?
Well, I guess my official context would be we have an initial 5-year mandate.
Okay.
And so if it's just me talking, or if it's me, you're asking me 10 years from now, we've continued to grow. We've continued to partner with provincial jurisdictions across the country, right? And I would hope that we would have had an impact, contributed to a positive economic impact across the province, with all of the north, the east, the west, helping to create some economic success and sustainability. Because the reality is, right now, like I also have the privilege of sitting on the National Indigenous Ec Dev Board, and we just put out our economic progress report last winter. And one of the markers for me that stuck out was that the gap in income between those living on reserve and not hasn't changed in the last 3 censuses. And so it's going to be programs like this that are going to help to address that. And so I would hope 10 years out, 20 years out, those gaps are gone, and we have healthy, sustainable communities with healthy people living in them.
We cannot have a public policy forum like this without a policy question, and that's top right there. I'm going to ask each of you one of you to step in, please. What policy gaps exist in provincial regulations that limits Indigenous economic participation in major infrastructure projects, and how can regulators help close them? There's a tougher question coming after this, but I'll leave it does anyone want to jump in on that?
Well, I can try. So I know BC best, and I think we're in an interesting time in terms of how we're looking to move the economy forward, and where the Indigenous community, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis have been positioned it's evolved from being something you need to do, a peripheral issue that we need to address, now to collaborating, partnering, engaging directly. And I think that also those types of relationships also need to extend to how jurisdictions like the provinces in Canada develop policy, right? So so that the Indigenous community isn't always just on the end of that, the result of policy development, but playing a greater role in how policy gets developed. and how that can extend to economic development matters, I think is a way in which we can move forward.
I would just add that what I see, and I'm based in Vancouver, is from a particularly real estate development point of view, there is a lot of blocking of opportunities by municipalities because although on reserve you can do more or less whatever you want as far as development goes, you still got to hook into the police, the emergency services, the water, the wastewater, and so on. And so you end up with a lot of tension between nations that want to develop on their reserves and municipalities that may be blocking that. And so having some more clear ability for the nations to work with the province directly, I think would be helpful.
Maybe I'll just add, around environmental approvals, and I know there's a lot of work to streamline. This is one of our major causes of delays of projects, but provincial regulators, when it comes to environmental, there's a lot of fear around duty to consult, and if an Indigenous community is a participant on the project, does that check the box? And nobody really wants to make decisions, and being able to make decisions and informed decisions, and having the right people in-house within those regulatory bodies, it can be really helpful. And I know the CER has a great Indigenous advisory body, but I think more of that so that government agencies can make decisions, because they often stop making decisions, or they're very slow to make decisions for fear of repercussion for an Indigenous community that might come out and say that they weren't consulted. So I think the duty to consult piece is still something that we're seeing some challenges on across different regulators.
I want to thank the panelists for your insight. I want to thank you for your questions. There's no way we could get to all of them. And just so you know, as running that they're flashing past so fast and they're gone. I want to go back to them. I want to thank the panelists for taking the time to share your insight on the early morning here at the Public Policy Forum. I want to thank you for coming to this first session. If you have any questions, the panelists will be around. Please ask questions. The one thing that we're going to need for active reconciliation in this country is a dialogue between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people, where people are not afraid to ask what's on their mind. Sometimes as Canadians, I said this at the beginning, we're too polite for our own good. And what we're facing now in the world economy is that there are no better people to ask than our own Canadians. So the solutions are here in this room. So I want to thank you all for coming, and I want to thank the panelists, and I wish you all a good conference.
Merci.